Let's try that again. Okay, there we go. Okay, so I'll start by talking about some common heap vulnerabilities. The first being buffer overread. So buffer overread can lead to information leakage, and an example of this is the Heartbleed vulnerability in OpenSSL from a few years ago. So Heartbleed resulted in the leakage of millions of users' private information on the internet. Use after free, just as the name implies, this occurs when an application frees an object but then continues to use it. Buffer overflow, I'm sure you're familiar with the stack-based buffer overflow. A heap-based overflow is very similar, except maybe an attacker is looking for something like a function pointer in a structure allocated to the heap that they can attack. And then lastly, double and invalid free. So a double free is when an application frees an object more than once, and an invalid free occurs when an address not associated with a valid heap object is passed to the deallocation functions. These last three can result in unexpected results, anything from program crash to hijacked control flow. And typically, the memory allocator forms the first line of defense against these vulnerabilities, but the Linux allocator doesn't provide any security guarantee. So it was designed to perform well as a general purpose allocator, and it uses a combination of bump pointers and free lists to manage the heap objects. So a free list is simply a linked list of deallocated objects, and a bump pointer points to the top of the heap, which represents the first unused portion of the heap. So I have a simple example here of a bump pointer modeled after the Linux allocator, and you can see this state represents the bump pointer immediately prior to an allocation request, and this is after. So you can see this is a very fast and simple mechanism. But the problem is the default Linux allocator wasn't designed for security purposes, and one of the issues is that it prepends metadata before actual objects. So you can see from this illustration, the metadata contains the previous object size, the current object size. There's also some status bits embedded in there, which I omitted just for clarity. And in the free space, it stores its free list pointers. It typically uses doubly linked free lists, which is why there's a forward and a backward pointer there. But you can see the problem. If an overflow occurs, it can not only crash the size and status metadata, but it can manipulate those free list pointers, which could give the attacker some control over the allocation functions. Also, it provides no randomization, which makes it easier for an attacker to determine which objects will come up for use next. And then lastly, it has poor handling of double and invalid frees. As an example, if the metadata is crashed, the allocator is unable to check the object status, which can lead to the same object being utilized more than once and could ultimately result in hijacked control flow. So as you can see, the default Linux allocator can't provide a good defense, which is why we have secure allocators, which are designed to remedy the situation. Two of these existing allocators are OpenBSD and Die Harder. Both of these are a BIBOP-style secure allocators, where BIBOP stands for Big Bag of Pages. A bag is simply a set of pages designated to hold objects of a particular size class. So for example, we might have a bag for 16-byte objects, a bag for 32-byte objects, 64, and so forth. Now, both of these offer randomization. Die Harder has log n bits of entropy. N is the number of free objects in the given size class. And OpenBSD ranges from 2 to 10 bits, again, depending on the particular size class. But the problem is both impose high performance overhead. We evaluated their runtime and found that OpenBSD had 34% runtime overhead on average, and Die Harder had 88%, and even up to 10 times in the worst case. Part of the reason for this is that they use bitmaps to track the placement of objects in the heap when there's faster methods available. Also, they utilize lots of system calls, particularly mmap. So anytime they need a new heap segment or new metadata, they'll use mmap to acquire that. And then lastly, they'll use the same heap for different threads, which can significantly reduce performance due to lock contention on those heap segments. So this leads into the motivation for FreeGuard. Up to this point, we've had a choice between performance-oriented allocators that aren't secure and secure allocators that are too slow. So if we were to plot these allocators on a pair of axes where X is performance and Y is security, we would see the Linux allocator about here, It offers good performance, but almost nothing in the way of security. By contrast, we have DieHarder, which has strong security, but poor performance. And OpenBSD is a little bit better, but it's still too slow. With 34% overhead on average, that's still too slow for many applications, which is why we developed FreeGuard. FreeGuard has similar performance to Linux, but offers a significant improvement in security. In particular, its memory layout allows it to perform well, but also provide a strong security guarantee. Now, FreeGuard also uses the BIBOP-style memory layout, but with some important differences. First, it allocates a large block of memory, which it then divides into individual heaps. So that large monolithic block is called a superheap, and then we divide that into individual heaps. Now, if we looked inside one of those heaps, we would see that it's made up of multiple individual subheaps. FreeGuard has a per-thread subheap design, so each thread has a dedicated subheap in each of those heaps. And then further, if we look inside the subheap, we can see that each of those are made up of 16 bags, all of which have the same size. And lastly, if we look up closer inside of a bag, we can see that each bag serves a specific size class, and that these size classes increase by powers of 2. So for example, in the highlighted bag, it holds 16 objects that are 256 kilobytes each, and in the next adjacent bag, there's half as many objects, but they're twice as large. So this gives us a range. On the small side, bag 0 holds 16-byte objects, and on the large side, bag 15 holds half megabyte objects. Also, when one heap is exhausted, the thread utilizes the bag with the same index in the next heap. So this is a very uniform layout because all the bags have the same size, and there's the same number of them per subheap. Also, there's the same number of subheaps per heap, and all of these quantities are powers of 2. So this uniform layout enables our information computable property, which means that given an address, in constant time, we can calculate the size class of the object, the owning thread, the starting address, and the metadata location for that object. And I'll talk more about the metadata shortly. So on deallocation, all we're given is an object's address, and we need to find out the location of its metadata as well as its size class. This information computable property allows us to do that in constant time, and therefore we can offer constant time deallocations. Also, this layout allows us to detect all double and invalid frees as well. So to further improve performance, we borrowed the free list mechanism from performance-oriented allocators. And if you recall, a free list is just a linked list of deallocated objects. And because we can insert or remove from a linked list in constant time, a Freelist-based design enables us to have constant time allocations. So this is a simple example of a free list. You can see in the initial state, it has a head and a tail pointer, which are empty. And then as objects are deallocated, they're added to the tail end of the list. Conversely, when we need to reuse them, we pull them from the head. This enables a FIFO object reuse ordering, which also makes it harder for an attacker to determine which objects will come up for use next, as opposed to something like a last in, first out ordering. So the free list-based design enables us to have constant time allocation, and the information computable layout enables us to have constant time deallocation. So this table shows the number of trials needed to perform either an allocation or a deallocation for each of these secure allocators. So for example, in DieHarder or OpenBSD, to handle an allocation request, they generate a random number, then they go to that corresponding place in their bitmap, and they check the status of that object. Of course, if the object is available, they'll go ahead and use it, but if not, they'll have to continue searching and repeating trials to find a suitable object for use. So you can see in our evaluation, we found that DieHarder took 2.29 trials on average to satisfy an allocation request, while OpenBSD took almost 5. Also, you can see that the maximum observed trials is also quite high. Now, going back to that constant time allocation and deallocation, this enables FreeGuard to satisfy both of these operations with a single trial. So this is one reason why FreeGuard performs better than OpenBSD and DieHarder, but it's not the only reason. And just to summarize those performance improvements, it's due to our information computable design, which allows us to do constant time calculation of an object's metadata placement, its size class, and other information. We have the constant time allocation and deallocation. Also, our per thread subheap design reduces lock contention, and we reduce the number of system calls. So FreeGuard calls mmap very sparingly. When it does, it acquires a large block all at once, which it then manages into heaps and subheaps and so forth. So now that we've seen which mechanisms allow FreeGuard to perform better than these existing secure allocators, now we can discuss what security mechanisms it provides. First is segregated metadata. So the BIBOP layout style can also allow us to separate the metadata from the heap, which helps to prevent against metadata-based attacks. So for example, we have our heap layout, and then in a separate part of the address space is the object metadata, which again, instead of using a data structure like a hash map to maintain the relationships between an object and its metadata, we can just calculate that on demand. And of course, having a fully segregated metadata avoids the problem we saw earlier with the Linux allocator, in which case a overflow will crash the metadata. Next is randomization. So all existing secure allocators provide randomization, and that's designed to increase the complexity of attack. We also provide randomization, but differently, we provide four-way randomization. So what that means is each per thread, per bag pair has 4 free lists and 4 bump pointers. And on allocation, we choose between those 4 free lists or bump pointers to satisfy that request. So for example, we'll generate a random number, let's say 14. We'll take 14 modulo 4, which selects free list 2. So of course, if free list 2 has objects available on it, we can use one of those to fulfill the request. If it's empty, we'll use the corresponding bump pointer to allocate a new object and return that to the application. It's also worth noting that even if free list 2 had objects available for use on it, there's still a chance that FreeGuard will decide to use the bump pointer anyway, just as a means of additional randomization. Guard pages. So a guard page is just like a regular page in memory, except it has all of its protection bits turned off. So any attempt to read, write, or execute on the guard page will trigger a segmentation fault and halt the program. So FreeGuard uses static guard pages, which are placed at the end of every bag, and it also uses random guard pages, which are distributed throughout the bag at a default proportion of 10%. So by default, 10% of the heap's address space is being dedicated to these random guard pages. And I say address space because guard pages aren't backed by physical memory, so this isn't increasing the memory footprint of the application. So obviously, this will help protect against things like buffer overflow and heap spraying attacks, because if the overflow were to touch one of the guard pages, it would cause a segmentation fault and halt the program. Lastly, Canaries. So FreeGuard implements Canaries by adding a single byte to the end of every object. Then when that object is freed, we check the canary to see if it's been modified. And of course, if it has, we let the user know that a buffer overflow has occurred. But in addition to that, we also provide neighbor checking. So for example, if we free an object, of course, we'll check its canary value, but we'll check up to 4 of its surrounding neighbors' canary values as well. So this was implemented to mitigate against the situation of long-lived objects. So some objects will never be freed, in which case their canaries would never have a chance to be checked. And of course, if the neighbor is not in use or if it's inside a guard page, we won't check it either, because if we touch the guard page, we'll cause a segmentation fault ourselves. Now, each of these allocators has some threshold at which an object becomes a large object, and they need to handle it differently. So for FreeGuard, that's anything greater than 512 kilobytes. So large objects in FreeGuard are allocated separately using a direct call to mmap, which is similar to the way Die Harder does it, but different from OpenBSD. OpenBSD uses a page cache, which it will use to try to satisfy that request. Then after deallocation, the memory is returned to the operating system by munmap, and this helps prevent use after free attacks, because any subsequent attempt to access that memory would result in a segmentation fault because this just unmapped. It's an unmapped range now. Whereas in OpenBSD, those pages can be returned back to the page cache. We use a hash table to track the size of each object, and we place the object at the end of the block to help detect overflows. So mmap is page-based. So unless the requested size is a multiple of the page size, there's going to be some slack space in the mapping. So we go ahead and put that slack space up front, so any overflow will go off the end of the mapping and trigger a segmentation fault. So it's effectively like having a guard page at the end of the large object. So you can see in this feature comparison that FreeGuard provides a feature set comparable to DieHarder and OpenBSD, but with some exceptions. First, FreeGuard and OpenBSD don't provide heap over-provisioning. So over-provisioning is a feature implemented by DieHarder in which a fraction of the heap is dedicated to being unused space. So the idea is that if we interleave this unused space with actual heap objects, if an overflow were to occur, hopefully it would be contained within one of these adjacent unused objects. Also, FreeGuard has a lower randomization entropy. So FreeGuard has a fixed approximate 2-bit entropy. And this goes back to the 4-way randomization that we saw before. Also, so FreeGuard can detect all double and invalid frees. OpenBSD can detect double frees, but with very low probability due to the way they implemented it. And DieHarder doesn't report either. Lastly, FreeGuard and DieHarder better prevent use after free in large objects as opposed to OpenBSD, again, because FreeGuard and DieHarder actually unmap the memory when that large object is deallocated, whereas in OpenBSD, those pages may go back to the page cache. So while FreeGuard implements a similar set of features, its primary contribution is in being a low overhead secure allocator, which brings us to our performance evaluation. So we evaluated FreeGuard using 19 applications. 11 were from the Parsec multi-threaded benchmarking suite, and 8 were real-world programs. The result was that FreeGuard had less than 2% overhead on average. And if you'll recall, OpenBSD had 34, and DieHarder had 88. I should mention that all the values that you see here are normalized to the default Linux allocator. So anything greater than 1 is slower than the Linux allocator, and anything less than 1 is faster. Now, among these applications that we evaluated was Firefox, which when we paired with FreeGuard, actually performed 5% faster than the default Firefox allocator. So for that reason, Mozilla is currently evaluating FreeGuard for possible inclusion in future projects. So I'll conclude by saying FreeGuard is a faster, secure heap allocator. It combines the benefits of both BibOp-style secure allocators with performance-oriented allocators. Its layout enables the information computable property. It has a reduced number of system calls, and it implements a proven set of security features, all with less than 2% overhead on average. Questions? Thank you.
Hi, from University of California, Riverside. I wonder if you have any evaluation on memory overhead.
Yeah, we do. The overhead is about 24%, I believe, but we don't have that on the slides, of course.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, John Criswell, University of Rochester. So one question I have is, since you're unmapping memory when it's deallocated, have you tested, say, really long-running benchmarks to see if fragmentation becomes a problem? All right, because A, you'll fragment the virtual address space, but B, by doing that, the operating system kernel's data structures, which map, which map the virtual address space, it may actually have to allocate more memory to track where all those little holes are at. So have you run any experiments on that?
We haven't, but I get what you're saying. That could be a possibility.
Okay, thank you.
Quick question. So
Sure.
can this be used together with a garbage collector? Building a garbage collector on top of this?
Yeah, I mean, this is essentially a black box
Right.
that just provides allocation and deallocation functions. So sure.
So would this affect the performance of some garbage collection algorithms rather than others because of your layout of the heap?
Uh, I mean, in theory, sure. I mean, I guess it would depend on the specific implementation of the garbage collector. But yeah, I mean, I'm sure that's theoretically possible.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.